Hello, I just want to welcome you guys to our next week 3, which we are focusing on Art Nouveau in the United States, which is kind of interesting. So, as I mentioned before, technology and travel, the advances made in like just different forms of transportation and communication now allowed merging design movements in Europe to quickly get to the United States. So the Art Nouveau movement in the United States was really birthed by two specific designers who we will look at this week, Louis Comfort Tiffany and Louis Henry Sullivan were our two designers that we're going to examine in more detail this week. So Louis Comfort Tiffany was a man that was experienced in artistic painting and stained glass and the decorative arts. And we talked about the Paris exhibition, and he did attend that and was very impressed and encouraged by the Art Nouveau movement, and so he really brought that back to the United States and produced just many examples of Art Nouveau in glasswork, stained glass windows, beautiful lamps, and different accessories that could be used in the American interior that represented Art Nouveau design. Eventually, his works were sold by Siegfried Bing in Paris in the original Art Nouveau shop, and so it kind of came full circle in that way. But he really, as a decorative designer and artist, was one of our founding fathers. Louis Sullivan, I think you're going to find very interesting because he did his work in Chicago. And so you guys, being maybe an hour away from Chicago, would really benefit from, I'd say, going downtown Chicago, going to the Art Institute. You'd see some of Tiffany's work there, and then I think it's the Wendella boat cruises do a really nice job of talking about the architecture in Chicago. And Louis Henry Sullivan was one of the founders of the architecture that we see now in Chicago. There was the Great Fire that destroyed most of Chicago, and that's when Louis Sullivan came back. He had been trained in Paris, some of his architectural training, and he came back to Chicago to help rebuild the city after the Chicago fire. So he was the father of skyscrapers in the United States. He was the first one to really look at the idea of building vertically versus horizontal, building in a confined space such as Chicago, and how to support the weight, veering away from the old historical methods of stone and that supporting the weight of a skyscraper to using steel and that kind of thing. He also had the idea of defining an American style. So he was inspired, and his style represents Art Nouveau in that it was very detailed and richly ornamented, and so he's kind of put into that category or movement. But he also was really interested in defining an American style. One interesting fact about Louis Sullivan is that even a more famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, was mentored by Louis Sullivan, and then would go on we're going to learn a lot about Frank Lloyd Wright's work. But one example of his work, there's many in Chicago, would be the old Carson Perry Scott building, which is now on State Street. It's a Target, believe it or not. It's kind of like, ugh. But I used to go there as a little girl when it was Carson Peary Scott, and just it was a beautiful department store, richly ornamented, um, outside and inside. So it's like a story or two of richly ornamented exterior detail, and then it, morphs into a skyscraper. Um, and so it's different from other buildings that you'd see in Chicago. But this is one of his really fascinating uh, architecture and interior design efforts. You'll see pictures of the old Carson Peary Scott store, just with beautiful lighting, and just the whole ambience of the store was just lovely. Um, and in my lecture, I'm going to talk about a couple other famous buildings in Chicago from Louis Sullivan. So I hope you appreciate this. This is a little bit shorter lecture this week, and we'll give you time to work on your renderings and blogging and that, but to really appreciate, locally what we have here as far as Art Nouveau. The influencers tended to be in our direct area, and so if you have extra time, take a field trip down to Chicago on State Street. The auditorium building that we're looking at in the lecture is now Roosevelt University, and so I'm pretty sure you can go visit that, and that is over by Millennial Park. But these are just some examples, and I hope you enjoy.